Welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. I am your host, Aaron Erber. This is a podcast about stories, myths, and the Catholic faith. Everybody, welcome to I Might Believe in Fairies. This is episode 3. I am here with author Sandra Miesel, and today we're going to be talking about we're going to have a chit chat about fiction and the Catholic imagination, and I'm sure a bunch of other stuff. And I'll let Sandra introduce herself.
Gentle listeners, I am Sandra Miesel. I have written, edited, packaged, analyzed science fiction years ago. I haven't been active in the field lately, but I do know a great deal about the history of the science fiction field in days of yore. My background is that I was originally intending to be a biochemist. I have a master's degree in biochemistry from the University of Illinois. I switched to medieval history just because I liked it. I went back have a master's in that. I went back for further study in medieval at Indiana University. And because I had the desire to keep writing research articles, I wound up writing amateur literary articles about science fiction, which caught the attention of the professional authors that I was writing about. And eventually I found myself with a professional career. Probably my most successful book was the Vinci Hoax, written with Carl Olson, who's the editor of Catholic World Report. And that did very well. We had to stomp with hobnail boots on Dan Brown. Dan Brown made $200 million. I had a new rug for my family room. However, I did my duty. I also wrote for Ignatius Press, Pied Piper of Atheism with Peter Veery. And that did not sell because nobody in the Catholic world cared about Philip Pullman. They should have, but they didn't. I have also co-edited an academic book about J.R.R. Tolkien called Light Beyond All Shadow, the religious experience in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, co-edited with Professor Paul Carey of Brigham Young University. And that's still available. You can probably find it in an academic library. Anyway, how did I get into science fiction? Well, I started reading it when I was 11 years old, actual genre science fiction. I'd always been interested in fairy tales and things like that, and we had in the house a copy of a science fiction magazine in 1953 that had a story, A Case of Conscience by James Blish, which is about a Jesuit investigating the culture of the first alien peoples that humans contact, and he's trying to determine if they might be a satanic trick because they look like lizards and maybe they're in league with Satan. It kind of leaves it open, but it's a very fascinating way to think about issues of can evil create, what is good, what is evil. And because it had this Catholic background, I felt it was safe to read. So James Blish was not a Catholic. It turns out later that my cousin played with his children when she was a child, but I didn't know that. Anyway, he is an example of somebody who can take a Catholic theme and make it the basis of a story without necessarily sharing the religious belief behind it. And a lot of the old authors were like that. Science fiction likes to trace itself to what-if stories that start to appear in early modern times, like Cyrano de Bergerac did a Voyage to the Moon story. But it really takes off in the 19th century with such people as Jules Verne and H.G. Wells, and many mainline important authors wrote science fiction, including Rudyard Kipling. In fact, with my friend David Drake, I co-edited 2 collections of science fiction authors influenced by Kipling. And he was, in the 1980s, the most important single influence on writers.
Kipling was?
Yeah,
wow.
Kipling. People even set Kipling poems to songs and sing them at science fiction conventions.
Wow.
Well, the mainstream authors used to write science fiction. It would appear in popular magazines, and then it got sidelined into a genre, small market interest by the appearance of pulp magazines, starting with Amazing Stories, which I believe the first issue was late 1920s. And it became associated with bug-eyed monsters and space travel and girls in brass brassieres and so forth and so forth. But a lot of people who then went on to write good, serious science fiction were first introduced to the field from those pulp magazines. And the pulp magazines had the practice of printing readers' addresses in the letter column. And those readers would notice, oh, Joe lives in the next town. I'll get together with him because we have this common interest. And voila, you suddenly had science fiction clubs. And by 1939, you had the World Science Fiction Convention, attended by a few score people. But fandom grew out of this kind of association. Even a lot of fans who were people who are interested in science fiction went on to become famous professionals. The editor, you said you have a friend who publishes with Daw Books. Well, the founder of Daw Books, Donnelly Woldheim, started out as a teenage fan. Isaac Asimov was a fan, so forth and so forth. And when I came along, having read science fiction through the 50s when I was a child and as a high school student, after we met in graduate school, I discovered that my husband also read science fiction, and I like to say that I married him to get his collection, because he had an extensive collection of paperbacks that he brought to school with him. And then we discovered that people held conventions, and there was one down in Cincinnati, and we went in 1967, and we made friends, and also began writing for these amateur magazines called fanzines, which originally were hectographed, and then they were mimeographed, and finally they even became quite elaborate color offset professionally produced magazines. And I found fandom an outlet for creativity, a stimulus to creativity, because I got involved in art, I got involved in costuming, I wrote poetry, I wrote a song, I began writing both serious analyses of authors, but also, just humorous stories about my life, satires and poetry and recipes and all this stuff. So as a result of writing this and going to conventions, the authors that I wrote about liked what I said, and they became friends, and they promoted me to their publishers. And then by 1977, I was invited to write articles that would be published in professional books, introductions and afterwards. Frankly, they were to plump out the size of the book more than anything else. But it was exposure, and it was a little spare change. I did write 2 versions of one novel. You want to hold up the novel, Aaron? Well, we're not.
Yeah, this is audio.
Yeah. Okay, I wrote.
I can do that.
A novel
but...
called Shaman, which was an expansion of an earlier novel called Dreamrider for Jim Bain, who was the founder of Bain Books and who discovered me and was in his life a nice friend to me. Poor Jim died about 10 years ago, but Bain Books is still going. And if you want to find the older, more traditional authors, the Baen Books list is the place to look for them. Well, fandom was, in those days, was like a small town of maybe 10,000 people that was delocalized over the United States and England and a few other places. And you interacted as you do in a small town. You're very familiar with these people, and some of them you like and some of you don't. And it was in many ways, a very supportive environment. If somebody gets sick, the community will gather and raise funds for him and try and take care of him, etc. But the field changed after Star Wars, 1977. We didn't realize it at the time, that it was being noticed by the major media companies. So now science fiction is a big media presence. Lots of science fiction or vaguely science fiction stories on television. You have the Marvel universe. And I happen to like the Marvel movies. I've seen most of them. I don't know that I'm going to like the next batch that they do, but they were enjoyable. But it therefore attracted a very different kind of writer into the field. And in about the last 5 or 10 years, as the old boys die off, the field has become obsessed with all the other categories of wokeness and sex and gender and race and colonialism and heteronormativity, etc., etc. I did not find myself at home. I don't read any of those people. I don't know any of those people, nor do I wish to know any of those people. But I can tell you about some writers that I think your audience would enjoy and are worth seeking out.
Could you go back? What sort of costumes did you design? Now, you were a big costumer.
Yes, I am a master costumer. That means that I won a prize at the World Science Fiction Convention Masquerade Contest 3 times.
And that's what makes you a master?
Yes.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
Okay.
And if I went back and wanted to enter the Masquerade Contest this year, I would have to compete in the master category. They have a master, a journeyman, and an apprentice category. But that was one of the most popular functions at the WorldCon. The WorldCon this year is in Washington, D.C. in December. It's normally over Labor Day weekend. It normally gets 3,000 to 5,000 people.
Okay.
It is not like the gigantic commercial conventions, Comic-Con, Dragon Con, that get tens of thousands. I think Comic-Con has gotten as many as 120,000, and those are not the same thing at all. But anyway, my costumes. The first one I did was the Persian goddess of fertility, and based on an ancient vase. And an image on an ancient vase. And I did the Queen of Air and Darkness from a Poul Anderson story, which is the Queen of Elfland.
Yeah, I've read that one actually.
You've seen pictures of that. If you look up Google my name, you can find links to video of these costumes or still pictures of these costumes. And that was done in 14th century medieval style.
Okay.
I did Jadis of Charn from The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
Exactly copied the illustration. That one was the most challenging one to make because I had an enormous, about a 12-inch high crown sculpted out of wire and paper mache, and it was gorgeous. It was purple and green, and I looked exactly like Jadis in those days.
you would wear the costumes.
Like Jadis.
So you would wear them, or someone else would wear them?
I looked like the picture.
Wow.
And then I did Mary O'Meara, who is a Eurydice figure from Poul Anderson's story World Without Stars, and that one won a prize.
Okay.
It was a filmy black evening gown that was covered with iridescent beads and sequins, and I had Art Nouveau style lilies cut out of iridescent white fabric on my chest and my back and my arms, and an iridescent crown.
Wow.
And I sort of dance down the runway to a song that had been written about Mary O'Meara, and that was the most successful one. Even a professional film director said it was a well-realized costume.
Wow.
And then my final effort was with partnering with a professional costumer, and we did the 4 elementals. And I was the salamander, the spirit of fire. She was the Undine, the spirit of water.
Mm-hmm.
And each costume was 25 yards of fabric.
Wow.
And accessories and jewelry, and we had a gnome and we had a sylph, and we won most beautiful.
Wow.
And at that point, I think I exhausted my interest in ever doing that again. But I did. And then my daughters have done costuming things too. My elder daughter is into Jane Austen fandom and has Jane Austen costumes.
Oh, wow.
And which someone else makes, thankfully. I don't have to make them. The younger daughter was in a Renaissance Fair group and played Mary Queen of Scots because she looks a lot like the young Mary Queen of Scots.
Wow.
So we're carrying on the tradition of the Renaissance Fair is folded, so she's not doing that anymore. However, we all like dramatic things.
Sure.
I won prizes at the Worldcon art shows. For designs based on images from antiquity, but also for astronomical embroideries. The astronomical embroideries made an impact on a professional artist, Ron Miller, who was the assistant artist at the Air and Space Museum in Washington.
Wow. And
he traded me a painting for one of my astronomicals. And then he made it possible for me to go to a space launch on the NASA Fine Arts team. NASA, since the beginning of the American space program, has had artists come down to the Cape and paint or draw or sculpt whatever they wanted to record other aspects of the experience beyond what pictures can show. And there I was on a team with a number of science fiction authors, artists, and also mainstream artists like Lamar Dodd.
Mm-hmm.
But that was a fascinating experience. They led us into parts of the Cape Canaveral complex that you can't go in. An ordinary civilian visitor cannot get in. We went in the vehicle assembly building. We went on the roof of the vehicle assembly building, which is a favorite gathering spot for vultures. It's 25 stories high, and the air currents coming off of it attract hundreds of vultures who glide above it beautifully. I also went as a reporter to the last space shot, Apollo 17, and I write about that experience in my novel, Shaman, which you will discover when you see it. I was a model for Kelly Freas, the old master of science fiction artists back in the day. He put my face on a lot of covers, usually with blue skin to make me look alien.
Yeah.
But that was fun. The trip to the launches was the most interesting thing that happened to me because of being in fandom and being in the science fiction field.
Mm-hmm.
As you have mentioned, and I have mentioned, we did these 2 novels, but I also published 6 short stories, some of which have a definite Catholic ambiance, because I was going to, in my careless youth, I was going to write an anthology of 10 stories set in 10 different areas of Europe in the 14th century, one per decade. And I published 3 of them, and I have a 4th one that never got into print. And maybe someday I'll go back and do some more about it. But the science fiction knowledge led to an invitation to write for the National Catholic Register in 1983, because I knew about neo-paganism.
I see.
I would say that there undoubtedly more practicing neo-pagans among science fiction professionals and fans than practicing Catholics.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true.
Yeah, they are. They're everywhere. They're generally harmless people. They don't worship Satan, but they're not satisfied with ordinary religion because we have not made conventional Christianity or for that matter, any other standard form of human religion attractive to them.
Yeah, we've hollowed it out.
This is very sad.
Yeah. No, I have people like that in my life too, and I'm, trying to get them to see Catholicism as the truth. But I can see where they're coming from, when they're like, well, I don't really like, Presbyterianism or the Catholicism that I was raised with as a child, because it just doesn't seem like there's anything to it. And, what they were taught, they're probably right, even though they're wrong about how substantial Catholicism actually is. But yeah, that's
yeah, I even had a sort of an ecumenical exchange once with Diana Paxson, one of the founders of the Society for Creative Anachronisms, who is a serious and lifelong pagan. And she was willing to consider worshiping Christ among the other gods. And I said, well, no, you really...
Pretty sure there's a commandment against
that is not the way it's done. But
yeah, that's frowned upon.
She was totally respectful, and it was an interesting thing. The result was an article for Crisis Magazine, The Witches Next Door.
Oh, I
if
see.
Anybody wants to Google that.
Yeah. In the past few years, I've kind of gone through some of your Crisis articles, and I've been reading Crisis for a little while. I kind of stopped recently, but I've read most of the ones you wrote. They're very interesting. Yeah, I recommend them. Should we talk about like what science fiction is, and talk about what that is compared to fantasy? Is there really a difference? Are they the same thing? Do you have any thoughts on that? Because there are some people who they put these hard boundaries around, science fiction and fantasy, but then you read somebody like Tim Powers, and he kind of just destroys that, right? Or even Gene Wolfe, who inserts a lot of mythology.
Yes, we will talk about Gene Wolfe.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on that? Are there actual differences?
Science fiction people like the word SF. We do not say sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Sci-fi was coined to rhyme with Wi-Fi in the 50s.
Really?
And it's too cutesy. The whole field is normally thought of as speculative fiction, SF.
I see.
By convention, science fiction is a story in which you extrapolate, but you stay within the bounds of known scientific or historical reality.
Mm-hmm.
You're pushing them. You may have faster than light travel, which probably isn't possible, but you're trying to justify it within a scientific context. And the story would not take place without your premise that involves science.
Mm-hmm.
Fantasy is based on something that we know doesn't exist. Not to knock your title, but fairies don't exist.
Well, it says I might believe in fairies.
There are fairies in the bottom of the garden, and they dance around in the most delightful way. But by convention, just by genre convention, stories of time travel, stories of alternate realities, or even caveman stories are considered to be on the science fiction side of the spectrum,
mm-hmm.
and stories where magic works are on the fantasy side of the spectrum. And you might, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are the exemplars of Christian fantasy, also Charles Williams, but Charles Williams was odd. I don't particularly like the Charles Williams that I read, and I don't read him. And then the cornerstone figures of science fiction, when it was still science fiction, were Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, and Arthur C. Clarke.
Mm-hmm.
I once had a chance to meet Arthur C. Clarke, but I preferred to take a bath. Yes, and I didn't miss him a bit. He is definitely had an axe to grind against Christianity. with a story like Childhood's End.
Right.
Which
he wrote in response to C.S. Lewis's book, right? Didn't he write that in response to?
No,
or is it the other way around?
I don't think so. Childhood's End is more. It's kind of using categories like Teilhard de Chardin used, that mankind is evolving towards an omega point, helped by creatures who just happen to look like devils.
Right.
Point tail, even. Isaac Asimov, definitely a very strong atheist, and I avoided being pinched by Isaac Asimov by grabbing his wrists before he could do anything, and I did not like him personally. There's going to be a TV series this season based on his old story series, The Foundation.
Yeah, I saw that.
Might or might not be good. I have no way of telling. Robert Heinlein was not a friend of religion either.
sensing a pattern.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily the case.
No.
You also had people who, although they might not be believers, were very respectful of religion, like Poul Anderson.
Right.
And his wife said I knew more about his work than he did. I wrote a lot of articles about Poul Anderson and even a small book called Against Time's Arrow. And Poul Anderson, although on the atheist agnostic end of things, was concerned very strongly with a desire for immortality, of breaking beyond the boundaries of entropy, that man needed challenge, needed to respond to challenge, and had the fate of waging a brave but futile war against entropy and the heat death of the universe. And he kept finding ways to try and get around the limitations of entropy, like his novel Tau Zero, where people in a faster-than-light spaceship literally outlive the universe and land in the one that comes after our universe. Or Genesis, where the entire universe becomes a sentient organism. And Poul was immensely prolific. I think he had the broadest range of anybody in the field, past or present. Equally good in fantasy or science fiction. He also wrote humorous stories. He wrote silly little poems. And I would recommend Catholic readers would find one of his early books, Three Hearts and Three Lions.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Very interesting. It's very positive about religion. It's the Danish Carolingian hero Holger Dansk catapulted back a modern man back in the world of Holger Dansk. And then he has another one of A Midsummer's Tempest, which is Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, set in an alternate England during the English Civil War, where magic works. That is a beautiful book.
Okay, I'll have to check that one out. I've read Three Hearts and Three Lions, and a couple of his short stories. But did he do translations too? Because what's Hrolf Krake's Saga? Is that a translation, or is that?
No, it's not a translation.
Okay.
It's his original version of it.
Oh, okay.
He did translate from the Old Norse. He could do that.
Yeah. Well, he went to the University of Minnesota, I found out, and that's where. Yeah, I live in Minnesota, so it's interesting.
Oh, his parents were born in Denmark. So he could speak Danish and he could speak French and traveled extensively in Europe. Very, very, very talented man.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Very, very helpful to me in the start of my career. Gordon Dixon was essentially my mentor in the writing end of the field, and I did his research for 25 years. His main work is called The Child Cycle, about the future of humanity, in which we reconcile the unconscious conservative half of human consciousness and the conscious progressive half of human nature. And we all come into we have entry to the creative universe, where we are empathetic and noble and moral. And basically, it's an attempt to create your own heaven.
Mm.
And he thought in private life that man was evolving into a god. Beg to differ with him. And the funny thing is that although he was not a believer, he had me buy a traditional Episcopalian Book of Common Prayer, and he prayed it.
Wow.
Every night in his old age.
Huh.
Because it was tradition.
Yeah.
See? It's the tradition of his ancestors.
Interesting.
And his brother was a distinguished man of Canadian letters who published as Lovett Dixon. And Gordy was always trying to live up to the standard that his brother had set.
Interesting.
I edited quite a number of collections of Gordy stories that which may or may not have my name on them, but I did edit them, and
Gotcha.
They're out there. Now we get to the actual fine Catholic writers.
Well, hold on one second.
Yes.
So before I want to get there, but I'm actually interested in, is there a real difference between science fiction and fantasy, or is that just for marketing purposes?
Well, partly it's for marketing purposes.
So I got a big argument with my friend about this.
Actually have different logos for their fantasy and their science fiction books. In reality, it's a spectrum.
Sure.
And you can write about anything. I once wrote a fantasy about book restoration. Probably the only one of its kind. But using magic.
Sure.
No, he was using a combination of magic and real world techniques in a world where magic existed. But a lot of people expect fantasy to be knights in armor and elves with pointy ears, a la Lord of the Rings. It doesn't have to be.
Right.
It can be anywhere. There's a whole tradition of urban fantasy,
right,
of which Tim Powers is a leading practitioner. It can be set on an alien world. I was a friend of the grand lady of the science fiction field, Andre Norton, who wrote both science fiction and fantasy. I think she liked fantasy better, but she would have both advanced science and advanced magic in an alien on an alien planet, compete with one another. But Andre was a very fine woman. Had a career spanning 70 years.
Wow.
Wrote well over 100 novels, probably more like 200 novels, and was a wonderful patron to women authors. See, women were rather thin on the ground in the early days of science fiction. They existed, but they were not the normative idea of a science fiction writer. Lee Brackett, who also wrote scripts for movies very successfully.
Star Wars.
The Big Sleep and a number of John Wayne movies. Rio Bravo and Hatari, and was an old-time pulp writer who wrote wonderful space adventure novels and was just an all-around neat lady. Yeah. But Andre, who used a male pen name and eventually made it her legal name, had come up in a time where to write a boys' adventure novel, you don't call yourself Mary Alice Norton. And so she became Andre Norton and was one of the favorite entry points of young people to science fiction. Her book, Starman's Son, Daybreak 2250, was the first science fiction genre novel to sell 1 million copies. Wow. And it's still in print from Baen Books. Baen Books owns the estate of Andre Norton that is not in print elsewhere. It owns Gordy's estate. It owns Poul Anderson's estate. And they are keeping some of those old books in print, which is how Baen makes its money, frankly. Now, the first dramatically successful Catholic science fiction work, and one of the very best, is Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller. And Walter Miller was an excellent writer. There are collections of his short stories that I would advise people to seek out. And Canticle of Leibowitz is an After the Atomic Apocalypse book where monks are keeping alive the learning from before the Great Fire.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually civilization builds itself back, and then it has another atomic war, and we have to start all over again. Walter Miller, when he was in World War II, was a pilot on the bombing mission that bombed Monte Cassino, and he never got over feeling guilty about that. And after the war, he became a Catholic, and he was writing science fiction. He was no longer a Catholic at the time he wrote Canticle for Leibowitz, but he still is using the framework and the values and worldview of Catholicism and that. And unfortunately, in old age, he was overtaken by tragedy and killed himself.
Yeah.
Now, there used to be notable Catholic writers who would maybe do a one-off of a science fiction book, like Robert U. Benson, Lord of the World.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Chesterton did things that could count as science fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Alfred Noyes, No Other Man. But also, the great spiritual writer Dom Hubert von Zeller wrote an apocalyptic novel as Hugh Venning called The End, which is still witty and amusing, even after it's become obsolete. It's also a rare book. I haven't owned a copy, but it's a fairly rare book. You had John Bellairs, The Face in the Frost. He was Catholic at the time he wrote it. He also wrote some hilarious Catholic humor for the old Catholic magazine, The Critic.
Okay.
Based in Chicago.
I didn't know John Bellairs was. I didn't know that. That's interesting. And you said he fell away. I'm guessing.
No, John Bellairs' Face in the Frost, which is very good and worth seeking out. He also wrote a number of children's books in which there's magic. The House with the Clock on Its Walls, which was made into a not very good movie. But it eventually became an Episcopalian.
Oh,
but
okay.
If you ever run across Saint Figita and other stories, it is side-splittingly funny stuff. And he was a sweet man too.
Patron saint of fidgeting in church. Is that what it is?
Well, yes, they're all funny things about the church, and these are extravagant saints like Saint Floridora and Saint Dragomira, Saint Figita, the patroness of fidgeting children.
Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. Yeah, that's funny.
So Crisis the Critic ran a lot of those, and then they were gathered up in this little book. R.A. Lafferty, another very strange man.
Yeah, I'm gonna cover him in this show for sure.
Oklahoma. Lafferty liked me. He wrote a limerick about me, and he once sat on my lap.
He was single, right? He never married.
No, he never married. He was a bachelor, and he came from a family of storytellers. But he was actually extremely shy, and instead of joining in the oral storytelling, he would write these stories, and they can be very amusing, or they can be very serious, or both at the same time. His landmark science fiction novel is Past Master, about St. Thomas More, set into a future on a world that is the real utopia, and he has to destroy it. That's a very readable one. Some Lafferty novels later on get very unreadable, but he also did some historical fantasies. I particularly like The Flame is Green, about the revolutions of 1848, where our hero, an Irishman, of course, because it's Raphael Aloysius Lafferty,
right,
is battling the son of the devil for the future of Europe.
Wow.
And the theme of it is the high hilarity of love and laughter is better than the doom and darkness of death.
That's the subtitle?
That's a quote.
A quote. Oh. I was like, wow, it's some subtitle.
Of the series. Unfortunately, he only wrote 2 books in it, and he didn't ever finish it. But Past Master and The Flame is Green and the fall of the Roman Empire and Oklahonali, about Indians in Oklahoma,
Yeah.
are all worthwhile. And there are collections of his short stories which are kind of easier to take.
Mm-hmm.
And let us now come to Gene Wolfe, most artistically honored of the Catholic science fiction writers. And he worked for Procter and Gamble. He was an engineer for Procter and Gamble, supposedly developed the process that makes Pringles potato chips,
Mm-hmm.
and looked like an amiable turtle. As he got older, he was bald and he had this huge mustache.
Very unassuming. He looked very unassuming.
Oh, he's totally unassuming, but in that head, in that extremely bourgeois exterior, was a mind such as we seldom see. Let me give you an example. One of his publishers asked him for a jacket shot, and that means a picture that they will put on the back flyleaf of your book to show the audience what you look like. Gene drove from Chicago area where he lived down into northern Indiana and asked a couple of friends, mutual friends, to help him take the jacket shot. He brought a jacket picked up at Goodwill, and he had it draped over my friend's shooting range backstop, and he fired at it with a pistol. He was not satisfied. The holes were too small. You couldn't see them, so he then took up a 350 Magnum and fired big holes in it. And the other day, I actually saw the jacket and the photographs.
Oh, funny.
And this definitely needs to be in his archives sometime. So he did that just as a joke.
Yeah.
He was really a wonderful man. He's a very serious, devout Catholic. He was a convert. He was utterly devoted to his wife, Rosemary. They had 4 children. Gene died only a couple of years ago. But he's probably more accessible in his short stories than in his novels.
I would agree. Mm-hmm.
He demands a lot of the reader, because the normal book, it comes to the end and there's a conclusion, right? That's what you expect to find at the end of a book, don't you?
Everything tied up, neat and tidy.
Yes. At the end of a Gene Wolfe book, it will say, well, of course, clever reader, you have figured this all out, so I don't have to tell you.
Right.
And the Book of the New Sun, which is actually a 5-volume thing, was his most significant fiction. And that got him a lot of honor. He was a Grand Master of the field, as was the people that I mentioned before. Andre Norton was a Grand Master. Poul Anderson was a Grand Master, and the big 3 secular experts. Now we come to a living science fiction writer of great talent, Tim Powers. Tim Powers is a very sweet man who lives in Southern California, and I believe is currently employed at least part-time as a high school English teacher.
Oh, wow.
And his specialty was literature of the early 19th century, Byron and Shelley and Keats and that lot. And he was mentored by Philip K. Dick, the master of The World Is Not Real, There's a Deeper Reality.
Right.
And I corresponded with Phil Dick. I never met him. But he was also very strange. He was very interested in spirituality, not a Christian variety, but he was very spiritual. And he was a mentor to Tim Powers and a number of other young writers in Southern California. And of course, a lot of movies have been made of Phil Dick works. The Man in the High Castle was not too faithfully adapted as a cable TV series, but the original Man in the High Castle is very worthwhile reading. It's an alternate history where the Axis won the Second World War, and they are defeated through creativity and humility.
I'll have to reread that one.
It's a really a very lovely, very compact book, and it won the Hugo, the Oscar of the science fiction field in its time. Tim Powers' best work is Declare! Which is a combination of the Arabian Nights and spycraft in the Cold War, and you have some famous Russian traders from England who are characters in it. And what Tim Powers does is set a magical or otherwise mysterious event within a very precisely researched and recreated real environment. Mm-hmm. He has made Southern California a wonderland of fantasy. And when his hero drives around the LA freeways, it's all real. All the things he shows you are absolutely real. At one point, before there were Google Street Maps, he had his wife drive him around, and he would film up and down the street so he'd have the right shops on the streets.
That's clever.
Well, Declare is really, really good. It won the, I think that won the World Fantasy Convention Award, which is very, very high honor. And I think his other best book is Last Call, which combines the legends of the Holy Grail but modern Las Vegas.
Right. And that book haunts me. Yes. In a good way. I think about it all the time. Declare too. I would think about both of those books constantly because there's something about them that's so the mythology in there is so deep that it just and it strikes you as so true. Like this is what happened, especially in Declare. This is the history of the Cold War, even though it's not. It's
because it's embedded in checkable reality.
Yeah.
And he does that very well. He started out, his breakthrough book was called The Anubis Gates, which combines the mythology of ancient Egypt and romantic poets.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah,
and
that's a good one
once he published that, he was off to the races, so to speak. and he also does a number of there's lots of short story collections, and occasionally like a little collectible chapbook with one story in it. He also wrote when he was just starting out, a very effective pro-life story that no one would realize usually was pro-life, The Way Down the Hill, about people who can swap bodies.
Yep.
And they achieve immortality by taking over the body of their next unborn child.
Right.
And one of the people in this group decides that this is wrong and he doesn't want to do it anymore, and he would rather live a natural life and death.
Right.
It's just a short story, but it's very, very, very well done.
There's another one, Night Moves. Have you read Night Moves by Tim Powers?
That's the LA Freeway thing.
No, it was one of his short story collections, and it's I don't remember where it takes place, but basically this alternate dimension bubble comes to town, and you find out, it's spoilers, I guess, if anybody wants to pause now and read it. It's the ghost of an unborn baby who her parents have aborted it, and she's come to take her parents into this alternate dimension forever, to do what with, who knows? It's very haunting.
I that one. And Powers has been happily married for many years, but they don't have any children. This might make him sensitive to such issues. He's done science fictionalized versions of mythology like Orpheus and Eurydice, which is actually one of the most popular myths to dramatize in science fiction.
Yeah.
Orpheus and Eurydice.
Yeah.
It's Dinner at the Deviant's Palace.
Right. I haven't read that one.
And he did a lot of things set in the world of the Romantic writers, Anubis Gates, but find me among the graves, hide me among the graves, and the stress of her regard.
Right.
Where we learn why the various romantic poets met the particular fates that they did, and what really drowned Shelley, for instance.
Yep.
And he's working on his academic knowledge in that. They're very good. And of course, he wrote the book on which an episode of Pirates of the Caribbean was based.
Yeah.
The book is much better than the movie. It has very little to do with it. The book is quite hilarious, about a man who gets swept up in a pirate crew through no fault of his own, and has to prevent Blackbeard from finding the Fountain of Youth.
Yep.
But and Tim is just a really, really sweet man, and I highly recommend his books. Another Catholic author who unfortunately now is dead was Fred Saberhagen. And he was the first writer that science fiction writer I ever talked to. And his famous stuff is the Berserker series, in which he wrote many, many things. Fred lived in Chicago and originally wound up in the Southwest, but he lived in Chicago and he worked for the Encyclopedia Britannica. And he created a series about alien killing machines that are enormous spaceships that will go through from world to world, utterly sterilizing them. And they are the enemies of all life. His collection, Brother Berserker, is really good, in which we have St. Francis of Assisi disarming a berserker weapon. And also we have a science fictionalization of the Battle of Lepanto and Don Juan of Austria as a hero.
Wow. I haven't read the Berserker series. I read the first 3 Book of Swords.
The Book of Swords. I have an article in the Book of Swords. I don't think he actually finished it. There was supposed to be 12.
Okay. I think there are 11.
Well, then he may have died before he could finish it. But an earlier series, which isn't explicitly religious but is very good and imaginative, is The Empire of the East.
Okay.
In which an atomic war has caused the world to become receptive to magic and not to science. So we have magicians raising alien intelligences, and the Empire of the East is a nihilistic empire that wants to conquer all of North America. But it's very well done, and it's one of those clever. The middle book is one of those clever things where it's told from the point of view of the villain from the first book, who has since reformed. Oh, interesting. Then you see his response to the world. I'm not doing this thing justice, but it's quite nice. It's quite a nice thing. It's a big compendium of all 3 under one cover called Empire of the East. And what other things can we say about science fiction? Well, should you read it? Well, yeah, why not? Obviously, you want to read it with discrimination because a lot of what's out, the newer stuff and the stuff that wins awards, is probably not what a believing Catholic would enjoy. But there's 70, 80, 100 years of other stuff that's very good. And also, Catholics should be at least aware of what's going on in pop culture, because that is what's forming our world and affecting children.
That's right.
Now, as I said, I like the Avengers. I didn't ever read the comic books, but I like the Avengers movies. And I know who they are. I did not watch Game of Thrones. I have never read George R. R. Martin, although I apologized him once without reading the story. My husband read the story and said, "You don't want to read this."
Oh, no.
We had to put him in the book because he was influenced by Kipling.
Oh.
Game of Thrones Thrones is so nihilistic. It is full of gratuitous sex and violence.
I read the first two.
Not recommend.
Yeah, I read the first two before I started practicing my faith again. And yeah, I just didn't want to read anymore. You know, it's if there were any justice in the world, I think Gene Wolfe would be more popular than George R. R. Martin. But justice comes at the end, I guess.
Yeah. George R. R. Martin was raised Catholic originally.
Oh wow.
He's an Italian background.
Yeah, well, he's come a long way, I guess.
That's long gone. Anyway, but even though read Game of Thrones, it was such a big thing in popular culture. It was helpful to know who Jon Snow and Cersei and Ed Stark were.
Right.
It's in the back of your mind.
And you know it's there. You know what the tropes are and the themes, and you can kind of gauge the culture, like what people are, where people are at spiritually. I think you can gauge by what's really popular at the moment, right? So, I mean, it's not like
they're naming children after characters in Game of Thrones.
Oh man.
Look for little Cerseis and Tyrions populating future schoolrooms. Now, Harry Potter attracted an enormous amount of controversy when that was coming out, because a number of extremely fervent Catholic writers, EWTN personalities, didn't like it. Magic is satanic and it'll lead your children to be a Satanist. No, it wasn't. Harry Potter's author, J.K. Rowling, is a Christian. She belongs to the Church of Scotland. She was basing the whole series on alchemy, that it's Harry's journey from an abused, friendless orphan to a fine man who has defeated the villain of the age by being willing to die for his friends. Harry is a type of Christ figure. Yeah. And there are a lot of spiritual themes in Harry Potter. Harry Potter is, in fact, a baptized Christian. Yeah. His parents are buried in a Christian cemetery.
Well, I always thought that the magic in Harry Potter, it's basically, it's like the X-Men, you know, you either have it or you don't. It's basically something you're born with, and you can't really, like, learn your way into it, you know.
No, you can't. So you can't. She makes that very, very, very evident. And it's just reciting a pseudo-Latin spell while waving your wand, which is made of such unobtainable things as unicorn hair and dragon's blood. So you can't have real magic wands. There is a great many meditations on bigotry in society. What is virtue? Can we reconcile with your enemies? At the end, the last scene in the Harry Potter books is Harry as a grown man and with his wife Ginny, sending off their first child to Hogwarts. Right. And since the Battle of Hogwarts, he has become reconciled with his dire enemy, Draco Malfoy, and they greet each other with a little civil nod at the train station, and their sons go on to become friends. And all the characters who survive in Harry Potter go on to have happy, fruitful marriages. They are virtuous people. So I wrote a lot on blogs and other places defending Harry Potter, and it pains me how much the books were misrepresented by certain Catholics who set themselves up as literary critics. And I even wrote a contribution to a semi-academic book on Harry Potter about the fourfold symbolism and how the four houses of Hogwarts are actually based on the four living creatures, which are the symbolists of the evangelists and a lot of other stuff in mythology and lore.
Interesting. Yeah. So, well, like Gryffindor, Griffin is
The
I just
griffin
learned
is
this. It's a
the
symbol of
symbol of the
Christ.
church. He's a symbol of Christ because he has two natures.
Right, and then the eagle is the king of the sky, and the lion is the king of the earth, and Christ is he mediates between heaven and earth, right? So
Yes.
the griffin is extremely Christ-like in symbolism.
Yes. Yes. And you have the eagle of St. John, and the serpent is not actually evil. Mm-hmm. There are evil people in Slytherin House.
Yeah.
But the serpent is the spirit of water and potential for change. In fact, that was the title of my article, Can Slytherin House Be Saved?
Interesting. Well, I always tell people, this is a big thing I talk about with my friends, snakes. This is kind of off topic, but animals, I think it's interesting. Animals have, they can, like the lion, the devil goes about like a lion seeking whom he may devour.
Also the Lion of Judah.
Right. And then, Christ is the Lion of Judah. And so this lion can be either one, and a snake is the same way, right? So Moses in the desert lifts up the bronze serpent, and the Israelites are healed. And then Christ in the Middle Ages, especially in like the Eastern Church, he's depicted kind of as a snake, on the cross. And
the snake is curled around the cross.
Yeah. Well, like the croziers of the medieval bishops would have a snake on them, like
or a dragon.
Yeah. So it's really interesting.
They did. And dragons, you find dragons all through medieval manuscripts, entwining the capital letter at the head of an article.
Yeah.
They aren't always evil. Michael O'Brien just was wrong about that.
Yeah, they're usually, I think snakes are different from dragons, but dragons aren't always evil, but they're usually evil, right? It's kind of, it's like, I'm reading The Wizard Knight right now by Gene Wolfe, and the dragons in there are evil, right? They're evil. And the dragon at the end of time, at the apocalypse, depicted in the book of Revelation is evil. And so they're often evil. But snakes, since they're a created being, they're an animal, they're not, they're going to be a type of Christ. They're going to point to Christ somehow, and they can also point to evil somehow because, every created thing kind of does that. So they're not, like, snakes aren't necessarily always a sign of evil. That's something I've been kind of wrestling with. And yeah, I've read up on your debates with Michael O'Brien and stuff, and it's very interesting. But
he's wrong. He's seriously wrong.
Yeah, it's a very like.
It's a very narrow.
Yeah, narrow is a good way.
It's a one-to-one correspondence in everything.
I think he's got a point, but it's very narrow, and so it's like, well, there's all these exceptions, and you have to take those into account when you're talking about symbolism specifically.
Yes, well, for instance, he condemned Madeleine L'Engle's Wrinkle in Time series because it has a good snake in it.
Oh.
And Madeleine L'Engle was a believing Christian. She was a high church Episcopalian who left the Cathedral of St. John the Divine because it had gotten too New Agey.
Wow.
So, it's I would not take Michael O'Brien as a critical guide in the world of science fiction and fantasy. There are. Oh, I also want to mention that Ignatius Press has in recent years been publishing a little bit of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently read The Eighth Arrow, which was written by a priest. That is very good. It's Odysseus in Dante's Hell.
Interesting.
And it's very nicely worked out. And there was another one called A Bloody Habit.
Yep, I've read that one.
It's a perfect pastiche of a Victorian vampire novel.
Yeah, it was good. I liked it. And she's got the author is Eleanor Berg Nicholson, and she's got a werewolf one, Brother Wolf, I think it's called, and that just came out, not through Ignatius, but through an independent publisher.
Somebody else, but they're dipping a toe in there. What else? What else can we say?
Well, do you think this sort of literature? Do you think there's an evangelical, not in like the terms of like the denomination evangelical, but like do you think these can be used for evangelization? Because I know one person I know said that reading Tim Powers' Declare kind of brought him into the church a bit. And I've had that experience too with other authors, like C.S. Lewis, and where I didn't know it at the time. He was baptizing my imagination, getting me to think, kind of helping me to think in certain ways. Do you think this kind of this type of literature has that potential? Is that something that people should be actively pursuing, or is it just kind of a side effect?
I think if you actively pursued it and you said, I'm going to write a science fiction story that will convert people, you would fail.
Yeah, probably.
You write your story and the effect comes out of the art. I mean, it's just like any other kind of art. It's the same thing as writing a mainstream novel. If you said, I'm going to evangelize with this novel, no, you write your novel and your belief and your faith come through it. Remember Tolkien saying that although Lord of the Rings is fundamentally a Christian work, even Catholic work, because I believe in the Holy Trinity and so forth, but I removed the cultic religion aspects of it so as not to contradict sacred scripture, but it's all harmonious. The values, the virtues, and vices of the characters are those that a Christian can easily recognize. The sacrifices, the Christ symbolism of the different characters, the fall of the angels, the fall of the Satan figure Morgoth,
right,
and Sauron, his deputy, are all something that will bring it to your attention. The Narnia books did function that way. Lewis did not write them for the purpose of evangelization. He wrote them because he saw an interesting picture in his mind.
Yeah. Why
is that fawn carrying an umbrella through a snowy wood?
Right. That's kind of people think that he wrote it specifically to evangelize, and that he wrote it to tell a story, right? He's just a little bit more obvious about it than Tolkien in some ways. I mean, Aslan, I think everybody knows by now, Aslan's a Christ figure, right? But Lewis he's more subtle in some ways too. I don't think he gets enough credit for that, but yeah.
Well, I love Lewis as a literary critic.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that the first work by C.S. Lewis I ever read was The Allegory of Love, which is a serious academic examination of medieval romances. And it made you want to run out and buy some and read them.
Yeah.
He is a wonderful style, an extraordinarily clear, limpid style, a clear, limpid mind. People are not as familiar with his, I think, best and most serious adult novel, Till We Have Faces, which is the Cupid and Psyche myth. And there's a lot philosophically going on in that, and it's a very, very fine book, which his wife helped him on, actually.
Oh, okay.
So it's a female viewpoint character, and she, I think, helped him characterize the women characters better than he had done before. His tragic, brief marriage to Joy. C.S. Lewis died on the same day as John Kennedy. Yeah. And so his death did not receive the amount of publicity it might have done.
Right.
There are also collections of his letters, if you want to really know C.S. Lewis. His once upon a time secretary Walter Hooper edited 3 fat volumes of his letters, and you get a wonderful sense of who the man was. And his book, An Experiment in Criticism, is a very good guide to judging literature. Yeah, little tiny book from an academic publisher, but it will help form your critical judgment.
I think I've mentioned, An Experiment in Criticism has come up in every episode I've done. I've only done 3, but but yeah, it's good. It teaches you how to read, in a lot of ways. It teaches you how to read critically, and if you didn't like something, I think he says something like, it's easier to talk about a book if you liked it. If you didn't like it, it's harder to talk about because somebody could come up with, well, here's what you didn't understand, about this book. And so you can be proven wrong, so it's easier to talk about a book, what you liked about it, than to write a negative critical review, which I thought was interesting.
And you should like the kind of thing it is.
Yeah.
If you hate mystery stories, don't try and review a mystery book.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's exactly right.
If you don't like space adventures, don't write a review of a space adventure. In one of his essays, personal essays, Lewis mentions a science fiction story that he read that he thought was a wonderful, beautiful, profound thing, and it's actually Food to All Flesh by Zena Henderson. Zena Henderson was a short story writer in the Southwest. She may have been a Mormon, I'm not sure about that, but she wrote stories about a different form of human being called the people, who had a lot of psychic powers and were persecuted for this. There are portmanteau collections of the people stories, the complete book of the people. And aside from the fact of whether Mormons are actually Christians as we understand Christian, the stories are very Christian in their feeling and in what they are trying to convey.
Mm-hmm.
The story that C.S. Lewis complimented was about a priest in the Southwest who looks out in the yard and there's a little spacecraft that's just landing there, and this little creature comes out who is obviously female and has babies, and she can't eat anything on Earth. The food would kill her except human flesh.
Oh.
And she takes a nip out of the priest and eats it, and then he would be willing to try and help her feed her children so she can leave, but she won't survive at the cost of harming the priest.
Wow. And
she gets back in the spaceship and she goes her way, and she'll probably die as a result. It's very, very short, very lovely little piece.
Wow.
And I would recommend Zena Henderson too. Another Christian writer, he was Episcopalian rather than Catholic, is Cordwainer Smith.
Yeah.
Paul Leinbarger, who was actually an expert for the CIA.
Yeah, he was a psychological warfare, right?
Yeah. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins, and his Instrumentality of Man has a number of overt Christian things, how the under people, artificial sentient beings created from animal tissue, preserve the old strong religion of the man on the two pieces of wood. And he did the Joan of Arc story as the dead lady of Clowntown, and it's a dog, a dog creature who's a young female who becomes the Saint Joan of her time. It's a lovely, poignant story, and there's a complete edition of the Instrumentality also. He has a Fall of Man story called Alpha Ralpha Boulevard, where the devil deludes Eve, and it all starts all over again. But anyway, that's about all I can tell you. Is there anything else that I haven't covered that you would like?
No, I think we're pretty much wrapping up. It's been very interesting. So a lot of these authors you mentioned in an article called The Cross and the Stars, which is where when I'm a revert. So when I kind of came back to the church, I read that article a few years after it came out, and it kind of stuck with me, which is why I wanted to have you on the show. And I was kind of wondering, like, why, like, this like, you list probably a couple dozen different people. And I'm like, why hasn't anybody done anything with this? I mean, you kind of gave us a list of all of these authors that are worth reading. They're all Catholic or Christian in some way. And so it's like, well, I'm gonna start a podcast, and I thought I'd have you on.
That's very, very nice of you. And unfortunately, even since I wrote, several of those people have died. Jerry Purnell died a few years ago.
Yeah. Well, and you
And
in our
he was a revert Catholic.
yeah, you mentioned that in our email exchange. That's really interesting. So he died in the church.
Oh yes, he definitely
Wow.
died in
Because
the church.
he was an Anglo Catholic, or he was some sort of
Yes, it's a very high church Anglo
yeah
Catholic.
Anglican. Yeah.
Somebody said that the Anglican parish he went to in California was more Orthodox than what you'd find in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. But he did come back to the church. It was his marriage situations.
I see.
And his wife was very nice. I had a lot of problems with Jerry personally, but he was an old Western man in the C.S. Lewis tradition. I think his children are keeping up his blog, Chaos Manor.
Okay.
If you want to maybe look into that. And although other than Inferno, which he wrote with Larry Niven, which is based on the idea that hell becomes purgatory for people who can learn from their torment. It's very cleverly done.
Yeah.
And then there's an Escape from Hell, which I haven't read. Niven was raised Catholic. His grandmother was Estelle Doheny, who was a great donor to the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
But no, I don't think Niven has any religion. He's a friend.
Okay.
But Purnell was roundly criticized for having an episode in one of his stories in which a woman pregnant out of wedlock refuses to have an abortion.
Wow.
The book reviewer said, well, why wouldn't she? That's ridiculous. And he definitely did not believe in abortion. Fred Saberhagen wrote, it's not a very good novel, so I wouldn't recommend it, qua novel, Love Conquers All, in which a few underground Catholics are working against abortion by transferring the embryos out of women. They give the women a chance that you could have the baby taken away and you won't have to deal with it, but he isn't killed.
Yeah.
And the editor who published that, Jim Bain, got a lot of static. And Jim Bain started out as a Catholic too.
Okay.
There are tons of ex-Catholics among the old-time writers. One lady who only wrote one book that I know of, Wilmar Shiraz. That was her pen, I think that was like her middle name, used as a pen name. Wilmar Shiraz. What is the novel? The Children of the Atom.
Okay.
Was a very devout Catholic, and you could certainly find that somewhere in used bookstores. There are specialty science fiction bookstores where they will get these old things for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
sounds good. Well, yeah, thank you. This has been a lot of fun. I learned a lot. So one question, I'm going to make this a recurring question, I think, every episode, and you've already answered it, but I'll ask it more formally. Are fairies real?
Only in your mind or in an alternate universe.
I did another episode about fairies specifically, and I titled my podcast "I Might Believe in Fairies" to be agnostic about it, because I think they're interesting. They're a very long-lived trope in the human experience, and so they're fascinating.
Have you read Lewis's The Discarded Image?
Yep. He addresses fairies specifically.
Where he discusses that.
Yep.
And you are supposed to think that the creatures that are in medieval romances are not necessarily demonic. They're just a different creation.
Yeah.
And I will say, in defense of fantasy creatures, and dragons, in the life of Saint Anthony, in the light of Saint Anthony of the Desert, when he goes out to the desert to seek the older hermit, St. Paul of the Desert, he is helped on his way by a satyr and a centaur, who are sentient moral beings. And St. Simeon Stylites, who sat on his column for many years, cured a dragon that flew up to him to have a splinter taken out of its eye.
Wow.
So dragons are not always evil.
Well, maybe we'll leave it there. That's a good note to end on. All right.
Okay, so
Well, I appreciate it, Sandra. Thank you.
you're welcome.
And yeah, if you ever want to come back, talk about Shaman specifically, it arrived today, so I didn't have time to read it.
Well,
Or your
thank
short
you.
stories.
Yeah, I would also perhaps like to talk about alternate history science fiction,
Okay.
which I like to do, because embedded in the novel are a number of episodes from an alternate history.
Oh, okay.
The heroine can access this other timeline, and she learns something from what she sees.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like alternate history. In fact, there's now even a special award for the best alternate history of the year.
Yeah.
And,
yep. Dragon Con, I think, has that.
The Sidewise Award.
Okay.
I don't know who gives it out, but there is such a thing.
Okay.
And a lot of the major writers at one time or another have done alternate histories. Poul Anderson's The High Crusade is a spaceship lands in medieval England near a group of people of men and their wives who are preparing to go on crusade, and the humans take over the spaceship and go off to the stars to crusade and spread Christianity among the stars. And it's funny, and it's warmly done.
Yeah.
It's certainly not. Poul was always good about that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and our historically based fiction, a lot of people. Well, Gene Wolfe, in fact, did a number of stories set in sort of real history.
Yeah.
The Soldier of the Mist, which is in ancient Greece,
yep,
for instance, and those are all very well researched.
Yeah. Well, and then Book of the New Sun is far future, so it's still supposed to be like our timeline.
It's our world.
Yeah.
It's our world, and I do not wish to reveal any of the little tricks that he uses, but it demands a lot of the reader.
Mm-hmm.
You don't usually have a torturer as your lead character,
right?
Who is actual torturer and very good at his work too.
Yep.
Severian, a friend named his psychotic dog Severian, and Gene was touched.
He would be. That's yeah.
I think he may have gotten to meet Severian, but he was touched. In fact, my children did a masquerade group at a regional convention as Severian apprentice and victim, and I made the sword.
Oh, Terminus S?
Yes, Terminus S. And my daughter cut off my son's head. Anyway,
oh, man.
This science fiction fandom is not what it used to be. You will not go to any convention and just sit around in the bar with your favorite author hearing funny stories.
Yeah.
But some conventions can be interesting if you want to just learn about the field and buy books and art and so forth. But it used to be its own little subculture, and its day, unfortunately, has passed. And my children grew up in it, going to a lot of conventions used to be family friendly, and we take them with us. My son said, well, it made me too tolerant of strange people. But it gave us an opportunity to meet people of entirely different backgrounds that we never would have met in real life.
Yeah.
People often class or age segregated in their social circles. But we made friends with all kinds of people that we just never would have met, and had fun, had wonderful dinner parties, eating Szechuan Chinese food, and going to museums and making costumes and going to the rocket launches. So in retrospect, I suppose it was a good experience, and whether it was a good experience or not, it made me what I am. And now I write for the Catholic Press. I've got 400 articles and several books, and a lot of interviews, etc., etc. And thank you very much for looking me up and having me. And you see, I told you, you turned me on and I talk.
Great. All right. Sounds good. Well, that's all I have. Have a good.
Thank you very much, and thank you, gentle readers, for putting up with me.
And where can we find more of your writing?
Well, just Google my name. Just Google Sandra Miesel and keep going back, and you should find a number of the Catholic press articles that are stored on the internet. And I wrote some of the most controversial things ever to appear in the relevant publications on Masons for Catholic World Report, on Catholic Paranoia for Crisis, not to mention the witchcraft. And I'm an expert on the genuine history of witchcraft.
Gotcha.
If you ever want to talk about that. And the witch hunt.
That'd be interesting. All right.
So,
sounds good.
Anyway, taking up a lot of your time, but thank you very much for seeking me out, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of I Might Believe in Fairies. Please leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. Please follow me on Twitter at Aaron Erber and like me on Facebook. If you're excited to see where the podcast is going and want to offer some support for the project, you can find me on Patreon. Music is by Alexander Nakarada, and podcast art was designed by my wonderful sister-in-law, Linnea Kisby. Until next time, talk to you soon.